Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. So I'm super happy, super excited to be joined today by Lucy, who's going to be taking us through and talking us through a bit about her journey with recovering from long COVID. So I'm very excited to dive into all of the things that have helped to her, things that have helped you get back to the position where you're at now. Um, and yeah, very excited to have a chat and hear a lot more of these positive recovery stories. So, Lucy, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Harry. Yeah, it's lovely to be able to speak and share some positivity.
Amazing. So, I thought we could kick things off with at the beginning of your journey, right? So, if we can go back to when you first got ill, what were the sort of initial warning signs? And I think it's always useful for people to understand this kind of position that you were in when these symptoms first started to arise. Maybe you could take us through that initial period when you first noticed that something was wrong.
Yeah, sure. So in February 2020, I caught COVID. Um, I think I actually caught it at a meditation retreat. So it was before all of the lockdowns had happened, and I was for a weekend living with a lot of people, and it began with pretty mild symptoms. So just discomfort breathing, pain in my chest when I was breathing, uh, something like a head cold, some chest pains on the left side of my chest, and so general fatigue. And I I didn't think too much about it. I thought, okay, maybe this is COVID, even though I didn't have a cough and I didn't have a temperature. But I kept working. I was really exhausted, but I managed to sort of push myself through a work day. And then I would sort of crash at the weekend or be exhausted at the weekend and just try to catch up on rest. And that just carried on for weeks. So because of it was that start phase of the pandemic where lockdowns were happening and there was a lot going on in terms of changes in work. Um, so luckily, actually, my workload reduced at the time, so I was able to rest more than I would normally have been able to rest. But I noticed as well then when I started to go for walks, I'd walk and then I'd end up feeling so exhausted that I felt like I couldn't get home. Um, so I was noticing that my normal physical activity I wasn't able to do what I normally did. I would get extreme exhaustion after doing a strength training like routine that I'd normally do. And I yeah, just sort of started limiting what I was able to do, resting more, and I already knew that viruses could turn into long term like ME/CFS conditions. So I was already kind of at the very beginning starting to do meditation. Well, I already knew about meditation, and then I was starting to do breathing exercises pretty early on. I was, yeah, trying to be careful with how much activity I did. And, but it was mild in the sense that I still could work, I still could socialize, I could still go for short walks. Um, and yeah, I actually gradually improved during that year of 2020. And I was living in the UK at the time, and I moved for a new job, and I felt fully recovered by the time I moved for the new job it was about October 2020.
Mhm.
And yeah, but then I sort of went fully back into everything again and the symptoms came back and sort of came back much worse really. And because I was in a new job there was a lot of pressure, so I didn't really want to take sick leave. I was trying to push myself through. I was also getting quite a lot of headaches and migraines. um, and I sort of went into a phase of denial at that time, which really didn't help. um, because over the coming months, then I got significantly worse.
Hmm. So for you in your initial phase then, was it kind of like a almost like a sort of creeping up on you, these kind of symptoms? So you clearly had some kind of an awareness of what was going on and some kind of an awareness of like what these long-term symptoms could turn into. You mentioned already ME/CFS, which I think a lot of people were kind of completely clueless, like had no idea what was happening, no idea like what any of these potential symptoms could be. So you had a kind of gradual creeping up, and as that happened, you sort of realized and realized that you needed to kind of take stock and sort of rest, relax, work on meditation, breathing, and things like this. And then was it the kind of the tipping point almost when you felt like you got back to being better, but then going through that process of like pushing yourself through this new job, new stress, new environment, tipped you over the edge where you went back into a kind of relapse.
Yeah, I think at the time I didn't I wasn't fully aware of the stresses that were on me, but I think
Hmm.
actually there was a lot going on in the background that I wasn't paying attention to. I think I had very much gone into a state of denial where I was ignoring my body and my inner experience, and I was just kind of carrying on. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, for me, I wouldn't say the symptoms probably initially didn't come on gradually. They did come on all at once, but they were not really severe, and they were probably a bit up and down. Um, and but I didn't have I had sort of what do you call it, a boom and bust cycle to some
Hmm.
extent that year, but not really significant because I was also being careful with what I did. But yeah, in late 2020 and 2021 was really when it became much more serious for me. It became much more debilitating, and um, yeah, ultimately, kind of 2021 was my worst year of being unwell.
I think I hear this kind of this sort of I spoke to Una, a former athlete, a little while back, and she mentioned about how there's this kind of trundling along at a sort of level where you feel like, oh, okay, like I'm sort of operating and able to do stuff, but in many ways you're kind of somewhat running on adrenaline almost, and you're ticking along at this level which seems sort of okay. And I think I've experienced this as well. I'm doing things. I'm sort of a little bit of symptoms and then kind of leveling out and being okay, but not really noticing the kind of undue pressure that you're putting on your body and the kind of low grade stress and low grade pressure that's constantly sort of ticking away. So I'm interested then in when it comes to 2021, could you talk us
Yeah.
through, what happened in terms of that kind of final bust and how things panned out after that?
Yeah, so I eventually had to take sick leave from work. I got a really bad migraine and I couldn't look at a screen. I also was getting bad orthostatic intolerance, so I couldn't sit up for very long. I just felt like there was an extra weight on my head or like on my shoulder pulling me down. And so I took sick leave from work, but then I was also struggling to do things like my normal supermarket shopping and my, um, to go for a short walk. I was living in a house with really steep stairs, and to go down to the kitchen was like two flights of really steep stairs. And so I was struggling really with just the basics of making food for myself. And even I was just trying to meditate all day because there was not much I could do other than that because I couldn't look at a screen and I was cognitively affected quite a lot. So then it came to the point that I decided that it might be helpful for me to move back to Dublin for 1 or 2 months for to have some extra help from my parents so that I can just rest. And my idea was it will literally just be 1 or 2 months and then I
Mhm.
will I'll be better again, I'll be back to work and everything will be fine. And when I came back I was sort of feeling a lot of pressure to see a specialist pretty quickly. And when I realized I had to wait, 3 weeks, there was a lot of urgency of feeling, oh, but like I can't wait 3 weeks. I have to see him now. I need to get better now. So
Hmm.
I felt a lot of pressure myself to get better. So it wasn't really even a relaxing couple of months. It ended up being a lot more stressful than I expected, because also my family didn't fully understand
Hmm.
what it was like to have this condition. And I think that just put a whole extra amount of stress and pressure on me, because they were encouraging me to go for a walk when I was like, you know, really significantly fatigued and struggling physically a lot. So I think I ended up getting worse, where I couldn't walk around the garden without like getting a migraine for a couple of weeks, or um I stopped being able to wash my hair. Like if I did wash my hair, I'd have the repercussions of a migraine, and
Hmm.
more significant fatigue, worse post exertional malaise. So I ended up for um, the second half of the year just being in my bedroom. I was able to walk to the bathroom. I was able to sit up to eat, but I wasn't able to speak to people on the phone. I um, wasn't if I did anything, I would just kind of have to pay a price. It was very much minimal amount of exertion. I could listen to some audiobooks, but I'd have to like slow down the speed.
Hmm.
And yeah, that was definitely the most difficult time for me, both mentally and physically, because I think when you are that isolated and when you've limited your life so much, you
Hmm.
can't do any of your activities. You're not in touch with any friends anymore. Um, Also, my job was a fixed term contract, so I knew that was going to come to an end, and then I wouldn't have work. So I think it was very it was very difficult. It was very scary as well, because I was constantly scared of potentially getting worse, potentially like not being able to eat, which I think a lot of people experience those types of fears.
I totally agree. I think it's a really, really interesting point and a really important one to pick up on, because outside of the obviously the burden of feeling ill is the burden of potentially not being able to provide for yourself, potentially not being able to provide for loved ones, for example. I remember when I was in a particularly bad state, and that had a financial implication, a financial pressure on me as a single 22 or 23-year old who was able to live at home and had the benefit of having people that I could depend on. So I can't even imagine for the many people out there, millions potentially, who have dependents who are, their life depends on them. So they might be carers, they might have children, and it's a whole nother kind of burden having this that financial and the dependence burden on them, because it just adds a whole nother layer of stress. It's like, if I get worse, if I get to the point where I can't walk to the shop, I can't go to work, then how does XYZ, how do they depend on, how do they continue, how do they survive? So I completely think that's a crazy stress to have on top of the having to focus on your recovery as well.
Yeah, for
So
sure. And I was lucky, that I didn't have dependents, and I can't
mhm,
imagine how difficult that must be for the people that do. And um, like I was lucky to be able to come back to my parents' house.
for sure, for sure. And like you said, also very difficult when people don't necessarily understand as well. It's because it's it's hard to. I used to be very cynical about it, but I think it is hard to blame people when it is so bizarre. Like, yeah, how do you explain to somebody? So the trouble is with this condition is when I go for a walk, I actually get the flu afterwards. Like, how do you
Mm.
how do you explain that to somebody? It's really odd. I mean, we were talking before, weren't we? And I mentioned about the difference in sympathy that I got when I had broken
Yeah.
my ankle. I had to have like a surgery on it and then put it in a cast versus when I started getting these symptoms, and the level of severity is like just a completely different, it's a totally different magnitude. Yeah, with my ankle, everyone's like, oh my God, are you okay? Like, is everything all right? I'm like, I'm fine. Like, it's all right. Like, it's nice and normal. It will recover. Everything's fine. But obviously with conditions where it's more invisible, it's totally different. Um, so obviously you're at home then, and you've had this kind of worsening of symptoms. You're struggling to go outside, and you obviously have this fear of regressing even more. What happened next?
So towards during that year, I was seeing a fatigue specialist, and I was lucky because um, he did really validate the condition. He also diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome. And he said, from his perspective, he sees them as the same. I mean, I didn't, to me, it didn't really matter whether I had long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome, or I just needed, in some ways, thinking about it as chronic fatigue syndrome made me able to research, who's got better from chronic fatigue syndrome, how have they done it, because that's been a condition that had been going on for much longer than long COVID. So the label for me didn't matter too much. But so he prescribed something at the end of 2021 that did help me to just be able to walk around the house and have a better ability to function.
Mm-hmm.
So able to speak to some friends on the phone. I began being able to go for short walks as well. So the medication was low dose naltrexone, and the way it works is it helps with inflammation. So it has something to do with the endorphin system. It switches it off for a couple of hours at night, and then your endorphins come back stronger than they usually would. So it can be prescribed for quite a lot of different things, and it wasn't a big shift, but it was such that I was able to have a much better quality of life. So I was still very far from being able to work. I was still not really able to leave the house very much. I had to say no to going to some friends' weddings, and I managed, like, during the summer of 2021, or sorry, 2022, to go to my brother's wedding, but it was really difficult. So I still had symptoms every day. I was still lying down a lot of the day. But just being able to have a little bit more cognitive capacity and just to walk around the house felt like a big relief. So I
Mm-hmm.
was really glad that that medication did help me a bit. Um, yeah, and I tried lots of other things. So I was trying different supplements. I was trying different tests for the microbiome in my gut. I was doing a lot of different research. I was trying different courses online. I tried a brain retraining course. I was open to anything that would help me. Um, but I also, because I studied psychology and I was working in the area of mental health, helping people with anxiety and depression before I got unwell. So some of the things that I came across, I already was aware of, like breathing techniques, meditation, um, the idea of thinking about what your thoughts are like, even just around your mindset, when you're unwell, and how can you um, be aware of what thoughts might be more helpful than others or less helpful. So some of these things that I came across in courses online, I found helpful, but it wasn't really new information. So I still, during that year, even though I was a bit better, was unwell, like pretty unwell, and um felt the burden of the uncertainty of not knowing when I'd get better, not knowing what I could do, what I could not do without getting some type of a reaction in symptoms.
Yeah, it's it sounds such a so up and down and so
Mm,
kind of on and off. But there are a few things I wanted to pick up on what you said there. So like the first one was around the sort of chronic fatigue syndrome versus long COVID
yeah,
diagnosis, and I found that quite interesting what you said, because I know a lot of people who have mentioned that. I know for you, you said that I was actually kind of very useful to have the just to receive the diagnosis, and to because it's something that you kind of have heard about, you know of, and I've heard of some people have the kind of totally opposite view where
yeah,
the chronic fatigue syndrome diagnosis was something that they were almost scared of. It was like the kind of scary word that you didn't
yeah,
want to encounter, because it's known to have no official kind of cure and things like
yeah,
that. I'd like to get your opinion on the kind of differences that we make between chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, because from what I see, in my opinion, chronic fatigue syndrome is essentially just the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome sustained for 6 months post a kind of viral infection or other similar type of illness. So that could be from mono, that could be from bacterial infections, it could be from burnout as well, even. Um, and then long COVID is obviously newer, because COVID is a much newer illness. I'd like to get your opinion on the distinction that we're making between the two, because do you think it's a helpful distinction to have that kind of split, or do you think it's unhelpful because they kind of end up being essentially the same sort of thing, just triggered by a different pathogen?
yeah. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think it is so individual because, like you say, for some people, they really fear that diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. And maybe that's because of the stigma that's attached and some of the information out there about it being incurable. And sometimes what you're told, even by doctors who diagnose it. I mean, when I was in the UK, I also got a diagnosis from a chronic fatigue syndrome service, and they told me that less than 5% of people recover. And that was 2021. Wasn't that long ago that they told me that. And I don't think those statistics are correct personally. I have seen so many recovery stories. I think they might be the services statistic, but they haven't followed up on me and asked me, have I got better or not?
Hmm.
Um, I don't think there's follow through. So I think in terms of symptoms, it seems like I'm not really an expert in terms of the varying differences between symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID. But I think they are very similar, and there's such a wide variety of symptoms, and it varies person to person that you could have two people with those two different diagnoses, but with very similar symptoms. Or you could
Hmm.
have two people with long COVID, but with very different symptoms to each other, you know. So I think uh, for me, I thought the similarities were helpful. I thought for me to think of it as either one or the other. I suppose I don't feel heaviness with a label in the sense
Hmm.
that I just think about it in terms of what are my symptoms, what can I do to help my situation, and can I find more information about this through through learning um, from the CFS community. Um, so um, I think it's very individual in terms of how you take it and what you glean from it, and the individual differences of symptoms. I think they're both awful conditions, so I don't know if there's a big difference in that respect.
Hmm.
Because also long COVID can be really severe or mild, and then also chronic fatigue syndrome could be really, really severe or really mild. So yeah, there's so much variation.
That's super interesting. I think it's quite quite a good approach to kind of have to it. Where you were saying like the label is kind of like, I don't attach too much weight to it. It's just a means to an end for me to receive some kind of treatment, or some kind of plan there what I can look at and plan accordingly. Because I think what a lot of people are, certainly speaking from experience, are afraid of is like the kind of dirty label of
Yeah,
chronic fatigue syndrome equals 95% never recover, etc., etc. And I think it's quite, yeah, it can be certainly quite alarming to have that. Where I think maybe for me it was like sort of long COVID has this kind of, it's sort of unknown, we don't know much about it, but then that also means we don't know if it will be forever. We don't know if it means this. Whereas chronic fatigue was like, yeah, this is, you won't recover. So that's a super interesting, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's a very interesting perspective. And the next thing I wanted to follow up on was the low dose naltrexone, because I've heard a lot about this. I've never tried it, but there's been a lot about it, and certainly on Twitter and other forums, people have mentioned it a lot. What were the things then that it mainly helped for you? Was it the cognitive problems, or was it also physical, where you were able to get about walking again? Because I know you said there was this kind of switch where it greatly
Yeah.
improved, or at least improved your quality of life to the point where you could live and you could have a decent life in general.
Yeah, I think it was both. So generally the fatigue was less crushing and less debilitating. So I still had this underlying fatigue all of the time, or like that would come and go throughout the day, or be worse or more severe, less severe during the day. Um, but the fatigue was just, it had just reduced, and I think my mind was a bit clearer. So for instance, the week before I started taking it, it was just a week before Christmas, and I'd ordered presents for my family online, and they'd arrived, but I thought, I'm just not going to be able to wrap them. I won't be able
Mhm.
to sit up for that long. I won't have the energy to wrap each individual present. Um, and I started taking it that week, and I was able to wrap the presents. So I just had that like extra bit of energy and capacity. Yeah. So it just made everything a bit easier symptom wise. And I also felt my body was less reactive. So I would still
Mhm.
react to activity, but it didn't feel as severe or as crushing, because I think beforehand, if I reacted to an activity, it felt like I was sort of crumbling from within. I had this weird feeling of like, you know, I can't stay sitting. I'm literally like a feeling like I was about to collapse or something. It was
Yeah.
really severe. Whereas it reduced that, um to, it was still there, but it wasn't so severe.
Okay, so it got to a point where you're kind of managing, and yeah, you can, yeah, do some normal activities at least, which is
Yeah.
which is always good.
Yeah.
Okay, so going on from this, then obviously you made a small amount of progress with the low dose naltrexone.
Yeah.
What then helped you over that next year to get from where you were then, where you're sort of better, but still experiencing a lot of symptoms and not really, living
Mhm.
a normal life? What really helped you then to kind of go forward from there to where you are now?
Yeah, so one of the main things that helped was actually coming across a book called The Mind Body Prescription, and it was November 2022 that I came across this book. So um, the and it's really based on this idea of the mind body connection creating symptoms. And
Hmm.
initially, I had been somewhat open to that idea, but I also didn't fully relate to it or resonate with it, because I thought, you know, even the times when I'm feeling really good, I'm feeling optimistic, I try to walk around the garden and then I have loads of symptoms,
Hmm.
I couldn't fully recognize that my thoughts or emotions could create symptoms. Um, but this book had a different perspective that I hadn't come across before, which was that repressed emotions could create symptoms or could have a role to play in impacting your nervous system, which then generates symptoms. And so it got, I suppose, alongside this new information, which I became really curious about, the book also really describes um, the type of person that gets these mind body symptoms. So the perfectionism, the achiever traits, the wanting to make the right decision all the time, be a good person. So I really related to what was in the book. And also, I had had unexplained symptoms in the past. So I had had injuries that didn't go away. I had had food intolerances. I'd had various different symptoms that were unexplained throughout many years of my life before long COVID. And I just started noticing some inconsistencies where I thought that where there was no explanation or I didn't know what was causing it, that there was a possibility that actually I'm not aware of my emotional inner experience, and that could be the cause. So, alongside reading this book, I had also been reading books on internal family systems. And internal family systems is a type of therapy where you are thinking about different parts of yourself. So, for instance, like having an achiever part, a people pleaser part, a perfectionist part, a manager part that likes everything to be organized. So, reading these books, I sort of combined a few different ideas. So when I came across this idea of potentially having repressed emotions, I used the IFS questions and concepts to try to become aware of emotions that I was less aware of by asking, does any part of me does any part of me feel a particular emotion or feel a particular way right now that I'm not paying attention to? Um, and I sort of dove into different books, different materials, different podcasts on this topic, and learned lots of different skills and techniques and ways of using this mind body approach for symptoms that for my symptoms. And yeah, it worked. It's hard. It's not something I would have even really believed would work for me, and I definitely, when I was really unwell, wouldn't have thought that, you know, repressed emotions could have been causing my symptoms. But the more I learned and the more I understood it fully, the more I really recognized, oh, this is what is going on for me. And um, also, then by experience of using these tools and techniques and noticing my symptoms reduce, it just gave me more confidence to keep going and keep using them. And that actually, this does work for me and I can keep making progress and keep getting better.
So in terms of this the kind of repressed emotion approach, because I think a lot of people obviously encountered brain retraining
Yeah.
and things like that, where your kind of nervous system is sort of on permanent alarm, right? And I think this has been shown in a variety of different conditions, like chronic back pain, for example. There was a study done that, and I've talked about this quite a lot, where there was nothing structurally necessarily like happening, and then the sort of the pain, the sort of signals kept on turning on, which in turn obviously
Mm.
flooded the system with pain. And there was this kind of approach that they used, which utilized visualization and trying to kind of welcome the pain almost when those sort of alarm bells were ringing, and that in turn helped to kind of settle down the system, which allowed your everything to kind of return to sort of homeostasis. So, like, could you maybe give us a little like overview of, certainly when it comes to like the techniques, for example, and what
Yeah.
is the kind of difference between this kind of repressed emotion approach versus this brain training approach, and where do the kind of differences there lie?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really interesting because there are many brain retraining programs available, and I had tried brain retraining myself um when, earlier, I think it was 2021 that I tried it. And I found the visualization helpful and I found some of the ideas useful, but it didn't give me a lot. I know for some people it does help them an awful lot, but it didn't for me. I think one of the biggest differences is that brain retraining often focuses on becoming aware of negative thoughts and then trying to move away from them and think more positively, and have positive visualizations. And there is a lot of research on visualization that, your brain doesn't know the difference between an imagined reality and a real reality that you're experiencing. So I think visualization can be really powerful. But within the mind body approach that I followed, which is based on the work of Dr. John Sarno, Dr. Howard Schubiner, um, and other doctors that have also started working in this area following their work. Um, it's really becoming more aware of yourself and your tendencies to ignore emotions, and instead of ignoring or repressing emotions, to properly deal with them. So that means actually experiencing emotions or trying to process them. So I don't think that's an area that's covered in any of the brain retraining programs that I'm familiar with anyway. And it can become a bit ambiguous, because you can think, oh, well, how do I know if I've repressed emotions? Because repressed emotions you could be completely unaware of. And I think it's not easy to figure out, and there is a bit of a gray area of not knowing, like, does this it can take a while to figure out if it definitely applies to you. But some signs are tendencies that you might have to push emotions to the side, and I didn't even realize I had these tendencies. But like, one of them might be that like you generally believe that, like, that you're fine and that you'll be okay, and you don't talk too much about your challenges. So, like, if someone was asking you how you are, you'd always turn it into a positive, like, yeah, I'm struggling, this is difficult, but I'll get there eventually. Not wanting to linger on the challenges that you have, wanting to um, put your best foot forward. um, Also, sort of laughing in an uncomfortable situation that's not funny is an example of you having an uncomfortable, or someone having an uncomfortable emotion and feeling uncomfortable, so laughing even though it's not a funny situation. So there's various different ways that we can, like, subtly repress emotions. And also, I think, based on how you grew up and what the narrative was in your home around emotions. Were you encouraged, if you had something wrong with you, were you encouraged to just get on with it, that you'll be fine, don't cry, keep going? Or, are you someone that, I think also with these achiever and perfectionist traits, often they can be related to this idea of being able to push aside our feelings for the end goal, being able to push
Mm-hmm.
aside the challenges and persevere, keep going. So those are just a few little examples, but the more I've learned about it, the more I've realized that this is actually something that I do, and it affects not only having generated symptoms for me, but also um, affects my relationships in certain ways, affects how much I work. Working all of the time can be a sign that you're not able to be with emotion, sit with emotion. So it's been useful for me to learn this in the wider context of my life, but it's definitely, for me, been an answer to the symptoms and the activation of my nervous system, which caused the symptoms. So I don't know if I've gone on a tangent there, if that's relevant to the question. Um, but yeah.
No, that makes a ton of sense, and I appreciate you sharing that, and also some of those examples as well. I think that's that's very interesting, because I think a lot of people would be able to potentially spot a few things there that maybe resonate or they can recognize in themselves. So I'm interested on like a on a sort of practical level,
Yeah.
because obviously, when we hear about the sort of the brain training kind of stuff, the sort of like we said, the hypothesis around it is that when you're having these kind of thoughts, that can themselves in turn trigger a sort of alarm bells essentially within your nervous system, which triggers a range of symptoms. And the whole concept is to have these positive visualizations at that time to kind of try and train your brain to automatically head in that kind of direction and lessen the overall load. On a practical level, then, when it comes to the approach that you had taken, what had you used to try and come to terms with this, help with kind of unearthing these repressed emotions, and in turn helping to sort of regulate your nervous system? How did you go about that? Was it through meditation? Was it through seeing therapists? Was it what was your sort of approach?
So, becoming aware of emotions can be difficult when you are not sure if you have repressed emotions or what emotions you're looking for, because the idea of repressed emotions is that you're not aware of them at all. And it might be that you know in the background, maybe you have a certain feeling, and it's then easier to become aware of. But I think if we're used to just always pushing things to one side and carrying on, it can become a habit. And so I found IFS really helpful. This is where you check in with different parts of you. So you might ask, does any part of me feel a specific emotion? Does any part of me feel in any way anxious about doing this activity that I'm just about to do? Or does any part of me feel triggered or sad? Even sometimes doing an activity again after not doing it for a while might bring up feelings of loss. And if you're used to just kind of pushing that to one side, it might be going in the background, it might be affecting your nervous system because you are not acknowledging some of those feelings and they're just going straight into the body. It's a little bit like when, for instance, if you're doing exams and you get like a dodgy stomach, you're or you get butterflies in your stomach,
Hmm.
um, or you can't sleep. When I used to do exams, I couldn't sleep, but I didn't necessarily feel really anxious. I mean, sometimes I did, but sometimes I didn't feel anxious at all, but my digestion would be off and I wouldn't sleep. And I would just think, oh, this is because I'm doing exams. But it's where the symptoms have, or the emotions of anxiety and whatever other emotions you have attached to doing those exams are in the back of your mind, and they affect the nervous system, which creates the symptoms. And the nervous system can create such a huge variety of different symptoms. So, even if we think about feeling embarrassed, when people feel embarrassed, their face goes red, and
Hmm.
the capillaries in your face need to change for that to happen. So the thing about the mind body approach and this idea of repressed emotions is that it's not saying that these are just things in your head or that you're creating the symptoms. It's physiological changes need to take place for your symptoms to occur, and they're very real and they're very debilitating. But that emotions and um, different triggers, psychological triggers, can have a big impact on our nervous system. And if we're not aware of those, then there's a huge area that is out of our control in terms of symptoms. And for me, it was so empowering to be able to at least know that this was what I needed to work on. And that by becoming aware of some of these symptoms or emotions or triggers, that actually, even though it wasn't always straightforward and perfect, that I could start to understand what was going on and how I could manage my symptoms differently. So, in terms of then the application of IFS, for me, it was really asking myself, does any part of me feel a certain emotion? And I might initially think, no, I don't feel anything. I feel fine. But I'd have to ask again and ask a different question and maybe write some things down and think about, well, what's been going on this week? Did I watch anything on the news that was actually quite triggering and disturbing? Did I have any conversations where maybe I wanted to say something, but I didn't say something because I thought the reaction would be really bad from that person? Were there any situations where I actually felt really triggered? Even a simple conversation with a friend, when you're unwell, they might talk about something really happy that you don't want to say. You want to be really excited for them and happy for them. So you mightn't say that actually for you that brings up a lot of sadness and loss and difficult feelings. But maybe you did have those feelings, but you didn't express them at the time, and you didn't express them afterwards because you're not used to doing this type of self-reflection. So reflecting on what the emotional trigger could be, and then it doesn't even need to be a deep dive or an outpouring of emotion, but recognizing it and noticing it and having some self-compassion towards it and learning to be with and sit with emotions was really helpful for me then moving forward. And actually doing that, just checking in. If symptoms were much worse, I'd check in, and after I'd do a check-in, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, my symptoms would reduce afterwards. So I would get a bit of relief after doing this, and I would be able to carry on with my day. And it took me a number of months of using this approach and using these techniques for my symptoms to completely go. And I think also using a mind-body approach, the aim or the idea is not that all of your symptoms will go and never come back. It's that you will know what to do when symptoms come, and it will be effective. So if I notice a certain pain or fatigue now, I don't worry that, oh, my long COVID is coming back and I'm going to get worse again, because I know that the tools and techniques I've used have been so effective that I'll be able to use them. And I see it as a message. There's something that my body's trying to tell me. There's something I need to become aware of. And how can I do that? And it's, different tools will help different people. And I think that's another maybe difference between this and brain retraining. This is an approach that you can personalize, and you can find out lots of different tools and techniques to apply. With brain retraining, often it's sort of a one-size-fits-all model. And everyone tries the exact same tools and techniques, but different people will have different challenges using a mind-body approach. Some people, if they're really perfectionistic, when symptoms come back, it's very hard for them to deal with symptoms coming back. But the response to symptoms is really important, and managing any part that's perfectionistic or sees symptoms as a failure or feels a big association between danger and symptoms. Those are things to work on if that's a big challenge for someone.
Mm. That's really interesting to hear that kind of different approach to the mind body approach as well, because I've obviously encountered a lot the sort of conventional, we say, like mind body stuff, and less so about the repressed emotions. But I really notice it, because I think where the symptoms, and a lot of people experience this, that the symptoms are so bizarre and occur at such weird kind of times that often are unexplained. You don't know why it's particularly happened here and not in this situation. Why does it happen when I do this and not then when I do this other exercise or other activity? And I've noticed that one of the sort of mind body techniques that I had used, where I was sort of sitting there taking in sort of what I was feeling, lightly kind of observing the symptom, whether it be the sort of brain fog or fatigue, and sort of watching it with kind of a lightness and a light observation, and then I would see it almost change and kind of subside. And I thought, why is that happening as well? So very interesting to hear, and I appreciate for the practical recommendations as well. So in terms of, because a lot of people who will see stuff around the mind body, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of this around, a lot of questions of this kind of mind body leading to the dismissal of physical issues that are going on. So how do you look at it when people mention about, because there's plenty of research out there around long COVID, chronic fatigue, etc. When we see issues within the like with blood clots, we see issues with different biomarkers that are completely, out of whack. What would be, from your sort of perspective, what would be your sort of view on where that is coming from? Is that, would you say, like a manifestation of this nervous system deregulation that is causing all of this downstream issues?
Yeah, I think so. So there was a study done at Harvard using the mind-body approach for patients with long COVID. And one of the things that's written in the study, it's done by someone called Michael Danino, is that all of this research that's being done on the physiological changes within people with long COVID, like microclotting, spike proteins, all of those things, they don't. It's not. Those could still be valid and happening and really useful research, because with the mind body approach, it's not saying that nothing is happening in the body, because like the example of feeling embarrassed and your face goes red and the capillaries change, your nervous system controls your blood pressure, your heart rate, so many functions in the body. So, but what the mind body approach is saying is that there's no structural damage to the body. So that's why you go and you get tests done and nothing comes back, where like nothing shows up in blood tests, nothing comes back. And maybe now with these micro things they're studying around oxygen levels and all of the different things they're studying, there might be changes, but there's no it's not like, I suppose, it's thinking about how could they have been caused in the first place, and if they could have been generated by the nervous system. I think also there's some studies around some particular, I can't remember the specific study, which is really annoying. But some of these changes can be found in the normal population as well, and I'm not going to name specific physiological changes because I'm not an expert in that area, but I've come across some people speaking about the fact that some of these things could happen, but that actually in a normal person that's healthy, this could be happening as well. So more research needs to take place, and I think there's definitely a place for this physiological research to happen. But I think if you are suffering right now from long COVID, the idea of looking into potential causes of emotion or repressed emotion, you've nothing to lose from doing that, because you could be waiting years and years and years for this physiological research to come out, and then maybe who knows what we'll find in the end, in terms of how will it all tie together and make a coherent explanation, and then give us a medication or a solution that's going to cure and completely change that. But I think it's a really important thing to think about. And I think, unfortunately, with this mind-body approach, sometimes when a doctor says, oh, stress might be causing your symptom, or, you're not really unwell, you're really fine. I had a lot of people dismiss me when I was physically unwell. And it's so awful, anxiety provoking. It makes you feel like you're completely not seen, like people don't see that you're unwell when you're really unwell. And I think there's a danger in talking about a mind-body approach in a vague way that's not well understood versus fully understanding the approach and understanding how it applies to each individual, and also for experts, for people like a general GP, how they understand the mind-body approach and how they explain it is so important, because one GP could be actually dismissing you by saying, oh, it's stress, you need to do some meditation, versus another that fully understands it, can fully explain it and tell you exactly what to do. Because I know I'm talking about IFS, and that approach might not be helpful for everyone, but there are different approaches that people can try. And I had read some mind body books before I fully understood it, and I just thought, I don't relate to this. I don't resonate. Like, how could emotions be causing my symptoms? It's not like I'm not unhappy. I'm not stressed in the sense that it's like really, really severe. So how could it, how could that really cause these debilitating, real physical symptoms? So, and I think also when people have been invalidated so much and dismissed so much, and when they've been stigmatized by saying, oh, it's your mental health, it's not your physical health, then they are naturally less open to this approach, and that's understandable. And, I think it does involve like an openness and a curiosity to fully delve into this and understand it. And I think different information will land differently with different people, different books. But I think it's a wider area than just, say, the brain retraining, or like people talk about this fear cycle where you fear symptoms, so your nervous system reacts, and then you end up getting more symptoms because you've been fearful when you were doing the activity. And I think that is part of a mind-body approach. But if that's the only part of a mind-body approach that's spoken about, not everyone will relate to that.
No.
And I think as well, sometimes it comes across as being too simplistic. Like, if this is explained too simplistically and not fully, and if people don't get a chance to fully understand and ask questions about it, then it just doesn't land, because it can't match up with your own experience of having such a complex condition that's so debilitating.
For sure. I really appreciate that sentiment. That's a really very nice way to look at it as well, because I think that's where a lot of people feel so kind of, a lot of resistance and a lot of, there's a lot of friction generated there, because so many people who are suffering with long COVID, chronic fatigue syndrome, have had these cases where you're dismissed, where you're told it's anxiety, it's in your head, you're imagining it, and it's so incredibly frustrating. But I think it's good, a really good point that you mentioned, that there's fairly little to lose by looking to do some kind of introspection and see how, regardless of what is going on, your reaction to that and how you can sort of control the things that you can control and affect the things that you can affect. And it's almost, I certainly found when I started with doing some more of the mind body approaches and meditation and looking into things like this, that at the very least, it gave me some degree of agency. And I knew that, and once I found that certain things were sort of working and at least helping me, I was like, okay, I've got some agency to do something about this now. I'm not sitting here waiting around for a treatment that may or may not come in the future. I'm controlling with what I can control, and realizing that this kind of desire for, I just need to wait till this and etc. It was making me more and more unhappy. And I think that it's a really nice point to say there's nothing to lose by taking a little introspection, looking, and trying to try some of the approaches as well. And like you say, finding an approach that may or may not fit. And again, it's not going to be I've said this quite a lot. I don't think it's like a magic pill or anything like that, and it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. But taking some time to reflect, to work on meditation, some mind body approaches, I think it can only do good, really. Like, it's not, I don't think it's going to harm you. It's not going to cause further damage. So as we're drawing to the end, Lucy, I'd love if you could maybe give us a little overview of what your life looks like now. I think it's super helpful for people to see where you've come from and where you're at now, and also any sort of lasting, parting advice that you'd like to leave with the audience as well. That would be amazing.
Yeah, sure. So now I see myself as fully recovered. I'm able to do sports again. So I'm back running, swimming. I'm planning to do some triathlons this year. I haven't done a triathlon before, so that'll be a new challenge. Yeah, and I'm actually physically better than I was before I got long COVID, because the issue of my chronic injuries before I had long COVID meant that I had a foot injury for a few years, an ankle injury for a few years that persisted, and I wasn't able to run. So getting back to doing sports has been amazing, because I love sport. You know, being able to go for long hikes, being able to swim in the sea, just being able to socialize normally is so nice. You know, you really realize how important just those little things are in life, when you can live a day without any symptoms and work and not have to worry. And I think one of the big things as well is just the fear is gone of, like, you know, not knowing. I think one of the worst things about this condition is you're put in a situation where you are really powerless, and there's so much uncertainty about the future, and you don't know how you can plan for the future. And like you were saying before, agency is so important. And I think, you know, even just the powerlessness of having a condition like this can have such a big impact. And one of the great things for me about the mind body approach was just that I feel now that I have the skills and the tools that if I do ever have a symptom again, I know what to do. So I don't need to worry about getting unwell again. I've also started working as a mind body coach, helping people with chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, and similar conditions, where they relate to this approach and they find that they like some support in applying it to themselves. Because I think, you know, it sometimes there are challenges within really applying it to yourself and understanding how to get over the setbacks, the challenging bits, how to fully understand it, how to fully apply it to yourself. So that's what I've been doing. I've also been making YouTube videos on this approach as well. So if anyone's interested in having a bit more information on what I've spoken about today, and going a bit deeper on some of these areas, how to apply the tools, I talk quite a lot about that on my YouTube channel. Yeah, and in terms of parting advice for people, I think really thinking about what you can control in this situation, what you can try, and keeping open-minded. I think it's so easy to think, you know, this doesn't apply to me, and I was there and I did that myself, about sort of thinking about the role of emotions, or the mind-body approach in general. But I think if you can stay curious about how it might help, or how it might apply to you, you're in a much better position than being like not willing to try, or not interested in wanting to wait for a medication to come out that will help. Actually, I did my master's thesis was on this area of perceived control, and I think the more perceived control that we have over our environment, over our situation, and the more that we feel we can play a role in changing our lives and our situations, you know, it's greatly associated with good health and good well-being. So just doing what you can. It's really hard. It's really hard when people are like in bed, can't get up, have limited capacity. So I understand how difficult it is, but just even taking little steps to learn a little bit more, and even if it's not about this approach, or if it's not about repressed emotions, like finding something that you do resonate with, that you think will help, and moving in that direction.
For sure. I think that degree of agency is invaluable, because it's incredibly depressing and soul destroying when you're sat there with nothing that you can do to try and alleviate an inch of the suffering. And it's one of the most crushing things. So having some degree of agency that you can at least be trying to do something, I find that incredibly helpful as well. Lucy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been very, very interesting to chat. Any links to the stuff that we've discussed, I'll put them in the comments below. Hope you all had got a lot out of that, and I certainly did. And thank you very much for your time again. And I'll see you all soon.
Thanks.